Hey everybody, welcome back to Tech Talk Education. This is Dr. Heldman here. It's the 7th of October. Yes, I've been several weeks now in getting a movie out to you. I apologize for that. My wife and I were taking a dual retirement and wedding anniversary Viking River cruise trip from Switzerland to Paris. It was an extended vacation, super fun, not a lot of time to do much of anything except walk behind a tour guide and learn about all of the great features of Paris. So that's where I've been. In this movie, what I want to do is, as we dive into PowerShell, we're going to need to know a little bit about object-oriented programming. And being a former server administrator, back office guy, I know a lot about programming, but I wasn't a primary programmer. But I did know about object-oriented coding, and I'm not sure that all back office people might be aware of that. So I wanted to do a little video here explaining what object-oriented programming is about, so when you get into the nuts and bolts of PowerShell, you'll have a better idea about what it's trying to accomplish. So this really isn't PowerShell per se, but it's an intro to object-oriented programming. Let's get started. Okay, now the example I'm going to show to you is a Python example when we get to the end of this slide deck, but it's going to be basically the same in PowerShell. So the good news is that object-oriented coding, or OOP, has a lot of the same sort of features regardless of the language that you're using, although the implementation may be a little bit different. So the basic idea behind OOP is something that you'll need as you go into PowerShell scripting. You should know that PowerShell and Bash and Python are considered to be scripting languages, although Python is being adopted to be a full-scale programming language as well. So it's called OOP. Let's go take a look at this. Now, you need to be aware of a handful of things. So we have what are called memory variables. And when you're writing OOP code, what you do is you go through a process that's called declaring a variable. So all you're doing is telling the computer, hey, I want to set aside an area of memory inside the computer, and this is volatile memory. This is in RAM, so if the computer shuts down, it goes away. And I'm going to store something here, and it's called a memory variable. Now, there's two things going on with a memory variable. The first is that you know it by the name that you give it, but the computer knows it by the memory address inside RAM. So it's important to remember that a memory variable is going into random access memory. That's the memory that you're looking at when you're looking at your screen. Everything's loaded into RAM, it's ready to go, but as soon as you shut down the computer, all that goes away. It's called volatile memory. And we call it a variable because it can change. So it's a variable because we can change the data. It's called a memory variable because it's stored in the computer's memory. Now, when you're declaring a memory variable, there's two parts. There's the declare part, which means I'm telling the computer the name of the variable. And then there is the initialization part, which is saying, okay, this variable is going to contain this piece of data. So I really like getting in the habit of declaring and initializing memory variables, but as you're reading coding books, you'll find that some people declare a variable and then use it way later on down in their code. So it can happen either way, and you need to know that there are two terms. Declare, which means I'm telling the computer what kind of memory variable that I have, and in the initialize process where you're telling it what the variable is going to initially contain. That does not mean that the data can't change. You can change the data as the program is running. There are little loosey-goosey types things associated with this. For example, if you have what's called a tuple in Python, you can't change the data once it's been declared, but that's neither here nor there. Also, you should realize that most programming languages, scripting languages like Python and PowerShell, oftentimes now will assume the data type, so you don't necessarily have to even declare the data type. The C++ language and C language, very rigorous. You have to tell it exactly what type of data is going to go into that data variable. But in the case of something like a Python or a PowerShell, if it sees a certain type of data, it makes the assumption that that's the kind of data that you're going to store in there. Now, what kind of data do we have? Well, we have a thing called a Boolean. This is named after Charles Boole. He wrote a book that dealt with the algebra of 0 and 1, just using 0 and 1 in algebra. And I'm like, I probably don't want to read that book. But Boolean, or bool, as you'll hear it shortened to, means true or false. That's all it means, true or false. So we often set Booleans as flags. Is it true that this is happening? Is it false that this is happening? You should know about what's called a decimal. It can often also be called a float. And what that means is that we have a number, and the number has a decimal and a certain amount of decimals following it, decimal numbers following it. For example, on the screen you see pi 3.14, and then you see the number 2, which is 2.0. Now I put 2 there because it's important for you to understand that if you declare 2.0, the system's going to call it a float and not an integer. And an integer is a number that doesn't have any vowels. So if I were declaring an integer type variable, I would just put in the number 2 and not the .0. When you see that decimal, it's indicating that you have a decimal type number, or what we typically call a float. The reason it's called a float is because as you multiply decimals together, the decimal number of decimals will float outward or inward. Then we have a thing called a string. Now, a string is kind of an odd idea. It can be any group of letters, numbers, special characters, and even spaces that are put together. And the most common idea is a sentence, like you want to ask the user a question, what is your first name, question mark. So that's a string. And we sometimes use double quotes to declare a string. For example, you can see I've got hello world there in double quotes. You can also use single quote marks, which I call a tick, and you'll see there that I have tick, a tick. That's a string, but it only has one character in it. You can also put numbers in there, but they're not really numbers. So if I say double quotes 3.1416, that is not truly a float, it is truly a string, ditto for the $sign there. So $sign is a special character, 3250, that is a string, not a float. And what's interesting about this is as you're writing code that's going to build an app, or you're writing, like a little input box for a website or something like that, you have to grab that data, you understand that it's text type data going into that text field, and then you extract it, and you might have to do a conversion on it into a number to make it work inside a calculation. Now, C and C++ have a special data type called a char. It stands for character. So just up above there where I have the string tick cap a string, tick cap a tick, that would be a char inside C and C++. What you're doing is you're saying, hey, I have a single character, but it can be a number, it could be a space, it could be a special character. And there's a real special type called an array. Now, you'll need to know when you start studying Python, Python uses what are called lists. Lists are a little bit different. They're sort of like an array, but let me explain an array first. So an array has a beginning left square bracket and an ending left square bracket, as you can see in the array called months there. And then inside the array, we put inside ticks or double quotes each one of the members of the array. And so we have Jan, Feb, Mar, April, and so forth. These are all what are called array elements or array members. Now, one other thing you need to be aware of is that inside an array, the computer knows about that data's address. Let me see if I can give you an example here. So in the months array there, this is an array, and I'm calling it an array because the data is all the same type. Jan is at array address 0. So these are called indexes. So Jan is at index 0, Feb is at index 1, Mar is at index 2, and so forth. And you can go in and you can iterate through the array. So you can tell a program to go into the array and find something, or you can change something at a position in an array, or whatever. And the main takeaway that I want you to know is that Python lists do not require that all the data is of the same type. So I have an example there. You can put 355, main, street, so forth and so on. You could even put not ticks around 355. That could be just a plain number. You could, if you did no ticks around 212, 222, 2222, it would do the math and then it would display that number. So the idea behind a Python list is that it doesn't worry about the type of data in each of the array element addresses. It uses the same idea, so list at 0 is 355, address at 0 is 355, address at 1 is main. It uses that same sort of idea, but an array is much more rigorous. All of the data that goes into an array has to be of the same data type, and you will run into this when you start doing machine learning coding. It's very specific, and so these arrays have to be laid out in a certain way. Now, OOP has 3 requirements. First of all, programmers write what is called a class. This is a piece of code that describes an object. We're talking about object-oriented programming. So the concept here is that we are going to create an object. And then when we create the object, we pass in certain characteristics to it. For example, if you have a first-person shooter game, an FPS game, I'm not a gamer, so I don't know much about this, but I having taught for a long time, I've seen a lot of youngsters play a lot of FPS games. They just love them, and so I think that's probably pretty approachable for most of you. So in an FPS game, what you do is if you want to create a brand new, I'm going to call them a shooter, you create a brand new shooter, that shooter is instantiated. So we are creating a new shooter. We say that we are instantiating a shooter object. And when we do that, what happens is we pass in what are called properties. So the properties of an object are the characteristics that have been given to it. For example, fighter object might have, one fighter object might have brown eyes, while another fighter object might have blue eyes. Gender, height, weight, number of finger, whatever. You get the idea. So the idea is that you're saying, okay, whenever I create something, it's going to have these basic properties, but then I can set each of these properties to something different given the object that I'm going to instantiate. So instantiate means I'm going to create an object, and what happens is when we go create an object, we call the class constructor. It's called the constructor, and we create that object using the properties that we pass in. And I'll show an example of that to you in a minute. We also have what are called methods. Now, methods are little pieces of bite-sized code that tell the object things that it can do. So that means that if you don't write a method for an object, it can't do that. So you've got to be very careful thinking about all of the methods that an object might be able to use, and then it inherits those methods. And so you need to know about inheritance. Inheritance means that I inherit the properties that you gave me, I get those, and then I inherit all of the methods, and you'll find in PowerShell that there are other methods that the object inherits no matter what. Now you should know that PowerShell is all object-oriented, so everything that happens in PowerShell is an object. Now I want to go out real quick to the Windows calculator, and I want to show you an example of the difference between properties and methods here. Okay, I've brought up the Windows calculator, and if I click the hamburger menu here and I go down to settings right here, you'll see here that I have an app theme. Now I have 3 choices: light, dark, or use system setting. This is a property. So I could have, for example, maybe I could have another calculator up. I could do a Win R and type in calc to bring up the calculator, and maybe I could establish a different setting here. So this is a property. But if I go back here, I have methods. And one of the methods that I have is standard. And then I have a scientific calculator. And it has a bunch of special methods tied to it that are different than the methods that are tied to the graphing calculator and so forth. So it's kind of a lame idea, I guess, but the idea here is I just wanted to show you a basic idea of what you're looking like when you're seeing these things instantiated. I have brought up a calculator object. I have instantiated that object. I've looked at some of the properties, and now I'm going through and looking at some of the methods, and the methods change given on the kind of calculator that I'm going to choose to use. I hope that makes sense to you. Okay, now I want to show you a practical example, and I'm going to use a product called Notepad++. I love this program. I've used it for a long time. If you've used Windows Notepad, it's like Notepad on steroids. So you have the ability to choose a language that you want to write code in, and it'll color code all of your code for you. It doesn't necessarily execute the code. It's really not necessarily for that, but it's a good way for you to write down code and get an example of what it is that you're looking at and how it works. So let me switch to that real quick here. And this is Python code. So I went up to language, down to the P's, and I grabbed Python. So it knows this Python code. And what Notepad++ is doing is it's color coding things based upon the way that Python would expect this to happen. Now let me run you through this real quickly. I'm not going to overdo this. This is not intended to be, oh my gosh, I'm overwhelming you with code. I don't mean that at all. But I do want to run you through just the basics here, because this is how objects are instantiated. So we've got a class here called human. And human has 3 methods inside of it. It's got what's called init, which stands for initialize. When I was teaching this in the high schools, I would call this the class constructor, meaning that when I'm going to create a brand new human object, I'm going to invoke the class, and I'm going to tell it, build me a new object. Let me show you the example here. So I've declared a new variable called person1, and I'm going to invoke the human class constructor. And I'm going to give this human a name, an age, and a gender. Now look at this. These are properties here. So this is a property. Name is a property. Age is a property. Gender is a property. These are the properties of the object. So when I tell it to instantiate this object called person1 here, what it's going to do is build a human object with the name Alice, age 30, and female. Now this is Python, so everything's cool here. You can see that it's keeping track of the age as an int, Alice is a string, and female is a string. Then I have 2 methods. Now Python uses the DEF, it stands for define keyword, and one method is called introduce. And so when we call the introduce method, you can always recognize a method. It has beginning and ending parentheses like that. So the introduce method, what happens is we say person1 introduce. And so it jumps in here to the class. It has inherited this introduce method here. And it says, hello, my name is, and then it goes and gets the name here. And in this case, the name is Alice. I am this age, so it's going to say I'm 30 years old, and I am a female. And that's how the introduce method would work. And then there's another method called have birthday. Happy birthday, name Alice. You are now 31 years old. And you could see how what would happen is if I had a different human object, it would have a different name, age, gender, eye color, hair color, etc. And I might have a whole plethora of methods that are associated with this, like run, eat, sleep, fight, shoot, whatever, that sort of an idea. So the main idea behind object-oriented programming is classes, and this is how it happens in Python. And then you have properties, and you have methods, and when you create an object, you instantiate an object, and it inherits. Here's my creation part. So this is my class constructor. I'll put class constructor here so you can see that. In other languages, you have to actually have a constructor that you build. Some languages have a deconstructor. It gets really complex. And you can inherit from other classes. So there's a lot of complexity that's there. But for our purposes, for PowerShell, we just need to know this basic little bit for now. So I call the class constructor human to create Alice. Then I introduce Alice, and then Alice has a birthday. And so we can see now that we get the age. We add 1 to the age right here, and then we output that she is now 31 years old. So these are called methods. Okay, I hope this is helpful. We're going to encounter this very, very soon now when we begin to dive into PowerShell. We're going to wind up getting into some OOP constructs that I want you to be aware of. And so I wanted to take a little bit of time just to explain what OOP is. Now guys, this is not exhaustive. You can take 4 years of Python, C++, C#, C language, Java, JavaScript. They're all OO based, object-oriented based, and they all have different ways of accomplishing this, but the ideas are basically the same. They do not change from language to language. The idea of instantiating an object, declaring a memory variable, creating a method, those kinds of things. Okay, hope you have a great day, and thank you for not getting too mad at me for taking my vacation, but we had a great time in Europe, and I will talk to you later. Bye-bye.